When U.S. Secretary Marco Rubio swept through New Delhi earlier this week, he left behind a massive number that caught economists completely off guard. He announced that India had committed to purchasing $500 billion worth of American goods over the next 5 years. The purchases target 3 critical sectors: energy, agriculture, and a massive expansion of India's information technology infrastructure. To understand the scale, look at how that $500 billion sits on a 5-year timeline. It dwarfs every previous average for bilateral trade between these two nations. Financial analysts were quick to flag the numbers. The Financial Times noted that it was puzzling why India would make such a commitment now, calling it a foolish move to sign an agreement that appears to take far more than it gives. India has built its modern economy on a foundation of fierce independence and high trade barriers. Accepting an agreement that takes far more than it gives contradicts decades of New Delhi's protective policy. To see why India is moving forward anyway, we have to look at the original contract, a deal that was completely rewritten by the US while the ink was still drying. In February 2026, the trade relationship looked very different. India and the US had just announced an interim deal that appeared to be a win for both sides. The math was straightforward. President Trump slashed tariffs on Indian goods from 50% down to 18%. In exchange, India agreed to scale up its imports of American aircraft, coal, and technology to reach that $500 billion mark. But the deal lasted less than a month. The catalyst for the collapse was an unexpected ruling from the United States Supreme Court. The court declared that Trump's sweeping, reciprocal, and fentanyl-related tariffs were illegal, stripping the administration of its primary trade weapon. The White House responded by invoking Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. This allowed them to bypass the court's ruling by imposing a uniform 10% tariff on all trading partners, regardless of any previous deals. India's preferential 18% rate was erased, replaced by the same 10% penalty applied to everyone else. The scale was now entirely out of balance, yet the purchase requirements remained. The U.S. used a legal loophole to walk away from its part of the bargain, but it is still holding India to the $500 billion purchase promise. This has left New Delhi in a macroeconomic trap. When you break that $500 billion down, the yearly burden is nearly impossible to sustain. This visualization shows the standard baseline for Indian imports. On top of that, India must now find a way to absorb an extra $100 billion every single year in massive purchases, like aviation engines and tech hardware. That burden is being squeezed by outside forces. Surging global oil prices, driven by the US-Iran war, are already draining India's available capital. At the same time, India's weakening currency makes every dollar spent on American goods more expensive than it was when the deal was signed. India was already in a fragile position. In the 2024-25 fiscal year, the country ran a total goods trade deficit of $283.5 billion. If exports remain stagnant, while imports are forced to spike by $100 billion a year, India will aggressively drain its foreign reserves to keep the deal alive. Fulfilling this obligation requires a massive, state-led shift to steer private companies toward American suppliers. Without it, the math is poised to upend India's entire trade balance. If the economic math is this disastrous, we must ask why New Delhi is playing defense instead of walking away from the table. The answer is geopolitical. India is increasingly worried about the Trump administration's recent outreach to their primary regional rivals, China and Pakistan. But there is also a personal element to this. Punitive tariffs were placed on India after Prime Minister Modi refused to nominate Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, turning trade policy into a tool of personal leverage. Secretary Rubio dismissed the friction, urging India not to take the tariffs personally. But the reality is that the U.S. is now aggressively weaponizing trade imbalances. This ideological clash was on full display in New Delhi. While the U.S. pushed its America First doctrine, Indian Finance Minister S. Jaishankar stood firm on his own counterpolicy, India First. Traditional trade treaties have essentially been sidelined. Instead, market access is used as a primary weapon of diplomacy and forced compliance. The $500 billion commitment now serves as a high-stakes test of leverage. It forces an emerging superpower to choose between its own domestic fiscal stability and its vital access to the American market.